Hey everyone, welcome back. Really excited. We have a very special guest, Dr. Paul Copan, who is going to be talking to myself and also Lewis on the question of some of the difficult passages in the Old Testament. Paul, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks. Great to be with you guys. Looking forward to a robust conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Looking forward to it. Lewis, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a busy week for me, but I'm happy that we're able to do this show. I should say that I'm really happy to have this conversation because Paul Copan's works have been a standard reference source for mine whenever I deal with difficult passages in the Old Testament.
Hmm.
Uh, and those difficulties do come up quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking forward to this discussion. And what I'm going to do is Lewis, I know you have a few
Hmm.
questions. I'm going to let you tackle those first, and
Hmm.
I'm going to come in towards the end and ask some follow-up questions.
All right, that sounds good. Yeah, so for those who are unfamiliar, Dr. Copan has written a bunch of works dealing with old problematic texts in the Old Testament. Two key works are Is God a Moral Monster? As well as Did God Really Command Genocide, which was co-authored with Matthew Flanagan. So the reason why I'm interested in this discussion is because the topic of Old Testament violence has actually come up a few times in prior episodes of this show. So we thought we'd bring in an expert to discuss that topic. Dr. Copan, or Paul, you said we can call you.
Yeah.
First of all, what prompted you to write these two books regarding Old Testament problem passages?
Well, it's been something of a longish process, which has also included other works. I did a book called Is God a Vindictive Bully? Which expands on a host of other issues while revisiting others and developing them further. And then I have two chapters in my co-edited book, Christianity Contested, and I have a large chapter on servitude in the Old Testament, another one on the question of warfare in the Old Testament. So those are the more developed to date pieces that I've done. And but it began in the aftermath of the New Atheists writing about the God of the Old Testament, Richard Dawkins saying that the God of the Old Testament is the most unpleasant character in all fiction. And so I was reading these New Atheists, it was around 2007, 2008, and ended up writing an article in response to their treatment of the God of the Old Testament, which I thought was fairly superficial and it just didn't really dig into any of the nuances. It was just very dismissive and rhetorical, and which is what you had come to expect of the New Atheists. But I wrote an article published in Philosophia Christi called Is Yahweh a Moral Monster? And the response to that was very encouraging, and I was prompted to take the questions further and develop them into a book, which led to the book Is God a Moral Monster, published in 2011, and then teaming up with Matt Flanagan in our book on genocide. Basically, spoiler alert, did God really command genocide? The answer is no. And is God a moral monster? No. And so, but that was in 2014. And so have done further work on contributing to other books and engaging in various conversations online and so forth. And so some of that stuff, you're interested, you look at paulcopan.com for some of the stuff that I've worked on, and Amazon as well. So that gives you a little bit of a backdrop. But it's been an ongoing conversation, and there are many challenges. It's a very emotional topic, but it's one that requires patience, and a lot of people don't have patience to dig into some of the weeds of this conversation. But I'm sure we'll get into more of that as the conversation today goes on.
Yes, absolutely. So I do want to ask, maybe I want to start off with like a general question, and it has to do with like, how should Christians regard the Old Testament law? Because if we look at the New Testament, it seems to display something of an ambiguous attitude towards the Old Testament. On the one hand, Jesus tells us, I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. And he frequently cites Old Testament passages, so he seems to regard it as fairly authoritative. On the other hand, you have instances like, for example, when he's arguing with the Pharisees about divorce, and he's saying that the only reason that the divorce law exists in the Old Testament was because God was making a concession to the Israelites, but he didn't actually want them to have divorce at all. So it almost presents the Old Testament law as something of a less than ideal moral code. So maybe how should we regard the Old Testament in that light?
Yeah. Well, you're right to point this out. And again, I go into a lot of detail on this, especially as I interact with Greg Boyd's comments in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully?, in which I look at the law specifically, and I talk about the degree of moral carryover, a significant degree, in fact, of moral carryover from the law of Moses, from the Old Testament to the New, although there are modifications. And of course, there's a new people of God, Jew and Gentile alike in Christ. And so this is different from the Old Testament's treatment of the people of God and how they're to conduct themselves with kosher food laws, with clothing laws, with Sabbath laws, and so on. But we see Jesus upholding the law. He tells the religious, basically those who are listening to the religious leaders in Matthew 23, that who sit in the seat of Moses. Jesus said, "You are to do what they say, but don't imitate what they do." And we see that Jesus is, when he's in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5, for example, he's not correct. He's not nullifying the law of Moses. He's not, saying it's irrelevant. Jesus is doing, and he's often quoting the law of Moses authoritatively, as you've mentioned, like in Matthew 4, "It is written, it is written, it is written." But Jesus also in Matthew 5 is addressing misrepresentations or misappropriations of the law of Moses. He's saying, "You've heard it said," not "it is written," but "you've heard it said, but I say to you." And so Jesus is dealing with this casuistry, with using certain texts to justify, for example, personal vengeance, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Look, the law of Moses says this. Yes, but it's in judicial contexts, and it carries over into the New Testament, and that God is going to judge people according to what they have done, which is basically the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth metaphor. And so this is but this judicial text was being used to justify personal vengeance, and Jesus was saying that's a misappropriation of it. So yes, there are concessions, though. The law of Moses does give certain laws. It assumes people will sin. It does assume a certain ancient Near Eastern backdrop by which we can understand these sorts of matters. But yeah, there are concessions, and Jesus, as you mentioned, Matthew 19:8, does say that Moses permitted certain things because of the hardness of human hearts. So the law of Moses is giving to us not necessarily the ideal, because we are often pointed back to the way things were at the beginning. You have male and female equality that is highlighted. You have fundamentally an affirmation of the equality of human beings, regardless of class and so forth. But with the fall, you have certain things that come into societies, and so the law of Moses is addressing them, sometimes as regulative or offering certain controls. But it's not giving to us the ethical ceiling, but more like a moral floor from which to operate. So there are concessions. So we need to understand that. But Jesus is not therefore saying that the law of Moses is somehow immoral or evil. And you do get that impression from certain contemporary renderings or readings of it from various theologians, but we'll pick up on that as well. But that's not the attitude of Jesus. And we see the law of Moses appealed to. We see capital punishment, for example, that whatever you think of capital punishment for today, Jesus and the author of Hebrews and And Peter in Acts, in one of his sermons, refers to the prophet who, if you don't listen to him, then that person is to be cut off from his people or destroyed. Hebrews talks about capital punishment, that if the law of Moses basically treated people this way, with in the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses, you had a testimony confirmed, then how much greater will the judgment be for those who apostatize? Hebrews chapter 10. So there is a firm conviction that these laws, that there capital punishment did take place, that there was this potential, at least, unless you commuted this to monetary payment, that these laws were in place. And that Jesus in Matthew 15 didn't repudiate it, but he said that he actually affirmed that capital punishment took place in the Old Testament. And rather than denying it, he's saying, no, this is what the Word of God says. This is what the Scripture says.
So it'd be accurate to say that it is given by God, but it is also provisional in nature. It's almost like, he's giving it with the understanding that certain elements of it would eventually be superseded.
Correct.
Would that be accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. But like I said, a good deal of moral carryover takes place too when it comes to sexuality, right, and so forth. So we don't want to, say that it's all on the level of kosher foods and clothing laws.
Mm-hmm. So with regards to, for example, the way it discusses, let's say, slavery, it's not necessarily saying that slavery is a good thing, but it's acknowledging that this institution is a reality, and it's regulating how it's to be conducted so that it doesn't become abusive. Would that be a good characterization of it?
Yeah, I would say, up to a point, although one, as I make clear in my book, is God a Vindictive Bully, I would stay away from the term slavery because it can be very misleading. It can bring a lot of connotations of modern slavery into the forefront. And I think that it's good to make clear that slavery is a misleading term, that a lot of our modern translations, they use language that is unnecessarily inflammatory, and so I think something like servant would be appropriate. You do have indentured servitude. You do have those who are foreign slaves, servants, who run away from their masters, and God tells the Israelites that they should be able to settle in any of Israel's cities rather than sending them back to their masters. And these ancient Near Eastern countries often had extradition treaties to send back a person who is treated as considered property, and the Israelites had a very different view on foreign slaves, servants in Israel, that they were actually to come to find refuge in Israel. And so things like the modern, antebellum South laws regarding the fugitive slave laws to send back a slave because he's considered the property of his master, that is utterly undermined by the mindset of the law of Moses. So
we can say that it's not exactly the same institution, even though they're referred to by the same term then.
Yeah, that's true. And so I think we just have to deal with some of those translation issues as they come, because sometimes the term Eved Adonai, the servant of the Lord, for example, is an honorific title for Moses and for Joshua, and that it's often in the book of Exodus, those who are serving, the Israelites who are, quote, servants or slaves to Pharaoh. God says he wants the Israelites released so that they might serve me in the wilderness. So you move from one servitude to another, from one kind of labor to another, as it were, and so it just depends upon the context to see what is going on here. Is it this harsh, oppressive sort of a thing, or is it something that is liberating?
Yes. So there's actually one problem passage that you tackle in Is God a Moral Monster? And I want to quote it. It's Exodus 21, verses 20 and 21. And it says here, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. So the two issues that often come up in the context of this passage is the fact that it seems to be almost giving an allowance for the master to beat his slave or his servant as long as they survive the beating. And also there's that term, it says for his slave is his money, and I know there's different interpretations about
Right.
what that means. So maybe you can shed light on this verse for us.
Sure. Yeah. And again, I go into more detail on this in the Vindictive Bully book, and then and also in the Christianity Contested book. But a few things need to be understood here. Some people think the quote slave or the servant is just a piece of property, piece of furniture, or something like that. Well, notice what a lot of critics gloss over is that it mentions that if a person strikes his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies, he shall be avenged. That is a common term used in association with capital punishment. That there is a death penalty for striking that person so that he dies. So this is considered murder. This is not an accidental. It's not considered an accidental death, but there is vengeance that is to be taken. And so that is first and foremost what we need to focus on. That this imagery tells us that the master cannot do whatever he wants with this servant of his, and if he does take matters into his own hands and strikes him so that he dies, there is capital punishment that awaits. Now, if that person, the servant, gets up and walks around and survives a day or two, the presumption is that person, that the master, the employer, did not do this, maliciously, that it was, it was rash, it was accidental, but not intentional, and immediate, and so there is latitude given. But notice that it doesn't say that the master or employer is going to be, it doesn't say that he's not going to receive any punishment. It simply tells us that he's not going to be capitally executed. A lot of people think, oh, he gets off the hook. No, he's just not going to be avenged. But there's typically monetary payment. Just in the same chapter, we have mention of the quote master who strikes a servant that either gouges out his eye or knocks out his tooth. A little bit of indentured servitude there. That knocking out the tooth part. That you have this mention of if that happens, then that person, the servant, is to go free without any further debt to his name, because there has been permanent physical damage that has come to him. So there is provision and there is care for those who are servants, that you can't do whatever you want with them. And really, when we talk about slavery, what do we mean by slavery? Well, we mean it is the absolute ownership of someone by another. And I mentioned in my book, Christianity Contested, that the very condemnation of using tattoos mentioned in Leviticus is actually a prohibition against slavery. To tattoo, in the best kind of the strongest case, can be made for tattooing is when you're tattooing someone, it's not having to do with paganism or something like that, but actually of one person belonging to another. It's kind of a branding of a human being, and the scriptures prohibit this. And so you have a number of mentions that, and indications of this, where human beings are not to be treated as property. Now, what about that mention of he is his silver or he is his money in that text? Well, it can be taken in a couple of ways. Note, first of all, that this is a mention, this incident is mentioned in the context of accidental injuries. And so in that accidental injury, just prior to this, there is the payment of medical fees. And so that silver that is mentioned in the next passage could simply be referring to that medical fee that is being applied to this person to care for his medical costs, which, again, the prior text just mentioned. And so it does tell us that if there is this attempt to try to care for this person in the next day or two before he dies, judges can make a ruling on this, that there were good intentions here, that it was not a malicious malicious attack. But keep in mind, again, it says he is his silver. Some, like the New American Standard said, he is his property. That's a totally misleading translation. It just means that you are, one, if you just take it in a straightforward way, without that context, you're only harming yourself by losing money, by injuring your own servant. You're paying his debts, but now you're injuring him. You're killing him. So that will only hurt your pocketbook. But again, we've already established, and we need to keep going back to this, that this person is not a piece of property, because there can be capital punishment because if he has been struck so that he dies, then the one who struck him will be capitally punished.
Right. So we could say that the text prevents some of the worst forms of abuse, like beating a servant to death or beating them such that their eye or their tooth is knocked out.
Right.
If I were to put myself in the shoes of a critic, I might argue that even then, it doesn't eliminate all forms of abuse. Because what if, say, a master will beat his servant, but in such a way that doesn't leave any lasting marks? There was still abuse done, but the letter of the law doesn't prescribe any kind of punishment for that. Or what if the servant is merely verbally abusive to the servant, like he's not beating him, but he's just shouting obscenities at him? Again, the law doesn't provide any kind of protection for those kinds of abuses.
Right. Well, I think this is a kind of, one, narrow way of looking at the law, and secondly, an uncharitable way of looking at the law. If again, we would want to read other persons' texts charitably, and there's kind of a golden rule here that you treat one another's texts the way that you would want your own texts to be treated, and so in many ways we want to say, okay, well, this is not dealing comprehensively with it's covering all exceptions here. We just have kind of a certain nugget, a certain scenario, and judges are able to make extrapolations. And this is not to guarantee that everything is going to be just perfect, that there's not going to be any abuse or anything like that. No, I mean, there's a certain presumption that you're going to love and care for those who are entrusted to you. You even have in that same passage in Exodus 21, people who say, I love my master, I love my employer, and I love to just live within his household the rest of my life. That's the kind of ideal that we're talking about. That is pointing us in the right direction, that there's actually a voluntary giving oneself to service for another person, which, as one Old Testament scholar has noted, that this is fundamentally undermining any sort of institutionalization of slavery or servitude, because you have this entered into voluntarily. Not to mention that you could have, just as foreign servants could run away from, other nations to Israel, so even within Israel, if you're in a bad situation, you could leave and go to a better situation to try to help to take care of your debts. We see this going on. It's not in the law of Moses, but we do see that this mentioned in 1 Samuel 25, where Nabal is basically telling the sons of the servants of David, he said, that servants are running away all the time from their masters, that this is not unusual. So why should I regard you, servants of David, as anything special, that you're in need of any sort of a help? This sort of thing happens all the time, and you can have people who are discontent with their own masters and running away and so forth. So it seems like that's not an unusual scenario here. But again, there is the basic commandment to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And how do you treat those who are entrusted to you? Job saw this very clearly in Job 31, where he's saying that he said, "Don't I and my own servant come to the same place? Don't we come from our mother's womb? So if I abuse my servant, won't the Lord know about this? There is this kind of an understanding that there's a fundamental equality here, a fundamental humanity that we're dealing with. And the world, so rather than looking at focusing on this or that particular law, let's look at the broader vision of the Old Testament and see how it understands every human being. Everyone's made in the image of God. That in the age to come, that male and female servants or slaves are going to prophesy, and that there is this. That there isn't that sort of a negativity associated with that station, because they're all are fundamentally equal, and that people are go into servitude because of economic duress, economic troubles that they're enduring. So it's not because they're somehow, as the Greeks maintained, they're born slaves and that there's nothing you do to change it. That's just their station. You have to accept it. It's hereditary, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't change that. The Old Testament has a far different vision or worldview, and we need to understand that bigger picture.
Yeah. Oops. Thank you very much, Paul. So I do have, I want to switch tracks a little bit and talk about capital punishment in the Old Testament now.
Yeah.
Now, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head exactly how many laws actually have a capital punishment attached to them. I think it's about 20 or
16.
so. Yeah. Okay. So that's lower than I thought, which is really interesting because a lot of misrepresentations of the Old Testament seem to assume that it is very liberal in its application of capital punishment. But based on that statistic, it looks like only a very small number of Old Testament laws actually have capital punishment attached to them. And
Right.
And if I recall, you mentioned in Is God a Moral Monster that in most of those cases, there is also the possibility of commuting the death sentence to a lesser punishment, with the exception of
monetary
murder.
payment. Correct. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I elaborate on this in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? And I look at and I've made a few modifications here, but I do mention that in 15 out of the 16 potentially capitally punishable cases, only one of them requires the death penalty, and that is murder. The presumption is, and kind of general agreement here, that these things could be commuted to monetary payment. I do kind of like a case study on the topic of adultery. Adultery is potentially punishable by death, but even though there's a lot of adultery in the law, the law of Moses, the other parts of the Old Testament, there's, in the book of Proverbs, even, there is not this presumption that once someone has committed adultery, you go to the judge and then it's end of story. There's the death penalty. No, these things were usually worked out interpersonally, like between two families or between the four couples. But there is no death penalty that comes for committing adultery, and this is how the ancient Near Eastern texts often operated. They would give you very scary sounding penalties. But largely the assumption was that this is just a warning: stay away from this, don't do this. But it's not as though they took some of these these kind of strong punishments, as literal. You do have two cases of literal punishment, Sabbath breaking and blasphemy in the law of Moses. But generally speaking, those kind of paradigm cases were not what was presumed that these things would be carried out under the law of Moses, so that there is a different view of how that was to be done, and that was a consensus shared in other ancient Near Eastern law collections. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, where if a builder is slipshod in his building, the building collapses, well, his own son should be killed. Well, who's going to go into the building profession if that's the kind of penalty that you might incur, having your own son put to death? Or if you're a surgeon and you botch a surgery, that you are to be put to death. well, again, you're not going to have people going into this if there's that sort of a danger hanging over your head. So there's been a common presumption that these things are hyperbolic in large measure, that these are not understood to be literalistic or literal. So there is that, and I elaborate more on that in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully?
Okay, thank you for that. So just some follow-up regarding that. So from a skeptical perspective, there are two things that someone might mention to that. One is that the specific places that could be capitally punished, a lot of them seem, at least to modern sensibilities, to seem like disproportionate punishments. So, that there's that episode in the Book of Numbers with the man who was carrying firewood on the Sabbath. Like,
Right.
I think to most people living today, we wouldn't think of that as something that should be punished by death. So
Right.
it's very alien to our sensibilities.
Right.
The other thing to note is that if there is that possibility of commuting the death penalty for some of these offenses,
Right.
why don't we see examples of such commutations in the Bible? It seems like whenever there is an opportunity to apply capital punishment, in such cases, the capital punishment actually is applied.
Yeah. King David is not put to death, for example. You have, he commits adultery and commits murder. You do have, there is for example, Cain, even though it's before the law of Moses, Cain is not put to death, even though he's killed his brother, murdered his brother. So you do see these sorts of exceptions that are there, and even in the book of Proverbs, 6 and 7, where someone who has committed adultery, there may be the death penalty that comes along with it, but usually if the person isn't willing to accept a monetary payment, which is the typical commutation, even when it says eye for an eye, life for life, and so forth. In the context of those mentions, 3 times, it's commonly associated with monetary payment. So you do have that sort of a buffering, even in where you have the ox that gores. In Exodus, there's mention of if a master is negligent and the ox gores someone to death, then there is to be capital punishment. But it then goes on to say, but he can also pay for this. And so I mentioned this specifically in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? So I do bring out some of these things in a much more pronounced way. And so this is something that is, like I said, it's part of the backdrop of the ancient Near Eastern cultures, that they had that sort of a mindset that you can have, as you mentioned, the man picking up sticks on the Sabbath, this is, and I'd say these are, kind of making a point in fledgling national Israel's life under the law. And so God is using these things to teach a lesson, much like what happens in Acts chapter 5, when Ananias and Sapphira are struck dead by the Lord because they are again, making it look like they have given all of the money that they've gotten through selling a property when they've actually kept back money for themselves, and because they've lied, they're both struck down. And does God do that all the time, or is that the kind of the standing penalty? No, but it's just kind of an exemplary penalty in the early church's history to, again, create a sense of fear, a sense of perspective here, that you don't take these sorts of things lightly, that these are very serious things that you ought not to do. So this is the picture, I think, that you have, both in the Old and the New Testament, although in the Old Testament there is capital punishment within the nation of Israel, as opposed to, say, church discipline in the New Testament. That'd be one of the differences between the Old and the New Testaments.
Okay, so let's say there is that choice between whether to give the capital punishment to someone who's committed a capital crime or to commute it. So it's up to the judge's discretion to determine which should be applied, correct?
Well, it may be is simply a matter of the injured party or the family of the maybe the person who's been killed, say by the goring ox. That it may be simply a matter of resolving these sorts of things, negotiating these sorts of things in terms of a monetary payment. So it would, like I said, even with adultery, these sorts of things, as we read in elsewhere in Proverbs 6 and 7, where there is this picture of, there might be a very angry and jealous husband who may insist on the death penalty. So he may even refuse the money that is being offered, but typically this would be a natural way of settling it. But you see that it doesn't go to the courts. It doesn't go to the judge. It's just something that's dealt with interpersonally. You do have as it were, the judge to back this up. But this is how these matters were commonly resolved.
Yeah, so that leads me to the other question I have. Like, what if you have a particularly vindictive plaintiff, or maybe in the case of blasphemy or Sabbath breaking, a particularly vindictive judge who would want to see the death penalty applied whenever it can be? Then in that case, there isn't a whole lot of room for mercy to be applied.
Right. Well, again, these are the sorts of things that are. It's not a guarantee that everything is going to work out just great. I mean, we have, what if a judge in our own day maybe hasn't had his lunch or something like that, and he's cranky and just maybe very, very vindictive feeling until he has his lunch, and so he's just going to give the worst possible penalty. I mean, there are judges. There's the presumption that judges are going to be put in place who are going to be reliable, trustworthy, who know the law well, and so forth, who are going to be fair-minded, and this is what is this is kind of the presumption, whether it be Moses or even when he's making assessments, when even when priests are to make judgments and so forth, that they are that there is to be this kind of even-handedness as they're instructing the law in the law and so forth. That was part of their responsibility. And the same thing with the judges. You hope for the best, but it's not a guarantee that every judge is going to be even-handed on this.
Right. Thank you very much. Now, I want to move on to the topic of war in the Old Testament. In fact, majority of the stuff that I wanted to touch on is on this specific topic. Now, in the Bible, I'm just going to start off by laying the general groundwork, because in the Law of Moses, we do have general rules for engagement when it comes to warfare. So the Bible is not like do whatever you want when it comes to war. So maybe you can start off by giving us a general outline of what are the regulations concerning war according to the Old Testament.
Okay. Well, there are some general laws or general pieces of wisdom to follow. I mean, you do see, say, certain stories. For example, when Abraham's goes to war, when Lot and his family have been taken, and so Abraham goes and retrieves them, engages in battle because this is unjust. We see that there is a time for war, a time for peace that Ecclesiastes reminds us of. We see that in Proverbs that you undertake war in a particular setting where there is a spirit of you get wise advice, where there's an abundance of counselors, there is victory. You have mention of in Proverbs 24, where there is the reference to those who are being led away to death, to hold them back, to exert just coercive force to protect the slaughter of innocent human life and so forth. So there are these principles that you see, even apart from reference to the Law of Moses. There are these principles that are lingering within the overarching worldview of the Law of Moses, the worldview of Israel. You do have mention of capital punishment as perhaps kind of in Genesis chapter 9. where if someone takes another's life, then by man that person's life will be taken, because that person has killed someone who's been made in the image of God. So there are things that can carry over when it comes to just war principles, or in this case capital punishment, but these things can be more broadly applied. When it comes to the Israelites engaging in the say the wars against the Canaanites, there is a call to trust in the Lord, because the Israelites themselves are not. These are not people who are militarily equipped to descend upon the Canaanites as though they were these hapless people minding their own business, and then the Israelites come in, swooping in, and level their cities. No, the Israelites are timid. They are ill-equipped to fight. They are outnumbered. They are going up against these daunting cities. They are, and that's why God says, tells the Israelites that it's going to be kind of a slow, gradual thing. You have fewer numbers, and if you go in and conquer quickly, or drive out the nations quickly, then you'll be overrun by the wild beasts and so forth. And so there is that mention. And again, experts on this, people like James Hoffmeyer and others, they might hold that there are probably about 10 to 20,000 Israelites who are coming out of Egypt. So a fairly small number comparatively. And so this is, again, we talk about numbers later if you want, how literally to take those, or how do we understand those. But you do have the Israelites who are going in, they need to trust in the Lord. If there's fear, then you can, if you're a fearful person, then you don't have to fight. We're told that's part, in Deuteronomy 20. So they're to undertake these things, and the primary directive was to drive out the Canaanites, rather than to quote mercilessly slaughter, as Greg Boyd says, the Canaanites. The command was to drive them out, and to really engage in what Kenneth Kitchen calls disabling raids against these cities. And I mentioned in my most recent work that the Israelites were actually fighting against Canaanite cities that are largely colonized cities of the Egyptians themselves. So they're going from one setting of oppression to potentially another setting of oppression. And I think it's helpful when we read these texts, and a little bit of stepping back and looking at this, looking at these texts from the perspective of maybe a non-Westerner who is living in a setting of oppression, where these people who are in these cities are the ones who are dominating, they're the ones who are oppressing. And so the Israelites are coming in, and sometimes when I'll preach on these things, these texts, people from Africa or whatever will say, we love these texts. They offer us so much encouragement that there's a God who protects those who are oppressed from those who are tyrannizing everyone around them. So there can be a different perspective here when we read this. But again, those are a few things that perhaps we could mention. I don't know how wide ranging you want me to be on this, but even as we look at issues related to hyperbole and exaggeration when it comes to, quote, utterly destroy or leave alive nothing that breathes, I say that this is exaggeration, that the wars of the Israelites against the Canaanites are largely combatant wars, that there are not combatant armies going against non-combatants. The cities in Canaan are these military and administrative centers that are dominated by the people of Egypt, by the king of Egypt. So that's the sort of perspective we need to get into, and we can maybe go into more details beyond this point.
Right. So yeah, there's actually a number of subtopics relating to that. Now, with regards to warfare, one thing I want to note is even before the Israelites get into Canaan, you already see an example of this kind of warfare against the Midianites. So in the comment section, someone asks about Numbers 31, verses 15 to 18. I'll just read it for the benefit of people who are unfamiliar with it. It says, Moses said to them, "Have you let all the women live? Behold, these on Balaam's advice caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. So this seems like a particularly brutal example, and occurs even before the Israelites arrive in Canaan. They're killing all the men, and they're killing all the married women, and the only people they're leaving alive are unmarried virgins, so that they can be wedded to these Israelite warriors. Do you have any comments with regards to this passage?
Yeah, I spend a good bit of time in this. Of course, I mentioned this in Is God a Vindictive Bully. I talk about two different scenarios. One is to see this, that notice the command that is given, and the structure of Numbers, 31, bears this out. Again, not original with me. Several other Old Testament scholars have noted this, but the command that is given is from the Lord, is for the Israelite army to fight against the Midianites. Of course, it was an act of treachery. It was an act of subterfuge, mentioned in Numbers 25, and so it was again initiated by Balaam, the pagan prophet, who was trying to find some other way to undermine Israel without directly cursing them. And so we see this taking place. And there is a judgment that falls on the Israelites. So there is Phinehas engages in kind of leading the charge against those immoral Israelites, and those who are joining with them, the Midianite women who are seducing the men and breaking covenant with the Lord. So it's a very serious thing that is going on here. But when God issues the command, what is the command? In Numbers 31, he says to Moses to go and fight against the Midianite army. And so we're told that the Israelites, they did what the Lord had commanded. So they fulfilled what God had commanded. Various scholars, however, see Moses as going beyond this, and going beyond what the command of the Lord had been, and tacking this on. And you see, in similar fashion, there's another place later on in the text where there is a command that is given, which is fulfilled, and then there is an additional thing that takes place, an additional order that is a kind of an outlier command that relates to the plunder and so forth. So that's one scenario, that Moses is commanding something that the Lord himself did not command, that he's going beyond, kind of like what Nathan did when Nathan told David to build the temple, and then he had to retract that. So I go into explain a lot of the context here of this, but again, this is well explained by the Old Testament scholar Ken Brown, who's at Whitmore College, or some college on the West Coast, but he lays this out in an article and unpacks it very, very effectively. There's another alternative, however, to see this as in keeping with the rest of the hyperbolic commands that are mentioned in Deuteronomy 7 and 20, and also in the book of Joshua and so forth, that we can see hyperbole here, that if the Midianites here have been utterly wiped out, which looks like would be the scenario if we took it literally, then we have to ask the question, what are they doing a generation or two later in Judges 6:5, where you have innumerable Midianites who are now attacking the Israelites again, engaging in these raids and so on. So it seems that and again, the battle against the Midianites, that not a single Israelite soldier perished. Well, I mean, it seems like it has that kind of an ancient Near Eastern exaggeration feel to it. So again, whether we take it as that kind of standard hyperbole, or if we can take it as an outlier command from Moses, I think you have two plausible responses here to that question.
Yeah, so hyperbole is actually one of the explanations that came to mind with regards to this. Another possibility that I thought of is that when we talk about the Midianites, we're talking about nomads, people who
Right.
are dispersed through a wide region. So it's possible that Moses' command doesn't pertain to all the Midianites as a whole, which would be problematic because his own father-in-law is a Midianite.
Right,
Obviously,
exactly.
Moses isn't going to go to war against his own father-in-law. So it may be just a single particular group of Midianites that is responsible for this.
Yeah, that's possible. I'm following John Goldingay and others who say that if we do take this command literally, it does seem to suggest that the Midianites have, in Numbers 31, been thoroughly undermined. That they've been kind of cut off at the knees. That they're no longer a threat. Whereas you see that they do engage in great as a great threat against the Israelites in Judges chapter 6. So again, there is that possibility, but it's so again we can dig into that, but again, there is people like John Goldingay say no, it seems pretty comprehensive here.
All right. Now, moving on, we could talk about wars against the Canaanites. Now, I want to mention zero in on one thing that you mentioned, which is that it was these were disabling raids, and they were
Right.
primarily aimed at urban centers. Now, in the ancient world, if I recall correctly, urban populations tended to make up at most like 5% of the general populace of
Right.
any given area, which means 95% of the people in the land would
Right.
have been living in the countryside.
Right.
And if I recall correctly, nowhere in Joshua or Judges does it mention any battles being waged against countryside Canaanites. So
Right.
what happens to those particular Canaanites that are living outside of those urban areas?
Yeah. Well, it's they are. Well, we have an example of that actually in Numbers chapter 20, or 21, where the Israelites are fighting against the two kings, Sihon and Og, and we're told, it's interesting that we're told the king. That Moses is fighting against the king, his sons, and his army. And again, this was not initiated by Moses. They were trying to pass through peacefully, but these two kings rose up against the Israelites and fought against them. And we're told that the king, his sons, and his army fought against the Israelites and were defeated. But before we get to that, we see that the people in the villages, in the surrounding villages, were driven out, and then the battle took place. So they were these inhabitants of the village, the women and children and so forth. They fled. They were driven out, and then the place was prepared for battle. And then we're told that that these kings were dealt with, by the Israelites. So the Lord gave them the victory. Interestingly, you see this recounted in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, the same battle. Whereas the previous mention in Numbers 20, we're told that it was basically a combatant warfare because the people had been driven out of the villages. But in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, which tends to use this very exaggerated, intense language that takes the material from Exodus and Numbers and ramps it up, whereas the Lord is going to drive the people out. Then it goes on to say that you're going to utterly destroy them, you'll leave alive nothing to breathe. So it really exaggerates that language. We have that same example here in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, where it says, instead of just a combatant army fighting against a combatant army, it's man, woman, young and old were, quote, utterly destroyed. And that's just not what the original account told us. It was combatant armies fighting, and that women and children would have been cleared out from that scenario. And so we can talk about other examples of that too, like the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, where we have the same sort of thing going on. But it gives you an example of how that language is used. And as you said, that the larger percentage of people, much larger percentages of people lived out in the hill country, in the villages and so forth, that these were citadels, royal cities, and that they were largely administrative and military.
Thank you very much for that. Now, at this point, there is one concept that I want to introduce to the discussion, and that's the concept of cultural genocide. So nowadays, we tend to take a broader view of what genocide entails. Before, it was just killing a group of people, but in modern discourse, even if you don't kill a people, if you wipe out their culture by forcing them to adopt another culture, or if you drive them out of their ancestral lands, that's usually regarded as a form of cultural genocide, quote unquote. So a modern critic might say that, driving the Canaanites out of the land might not be as bad as physically killing them, but it is still a form of genocide insofar as you're committing a crime against them. And we know that in the Bible, dispossessing is a form of punishment because God threatens the Israelites with dispossession if they disobey the law.
Yeah.
So,
well, I actually had a conversation with Randall Rouser on this, and I said, just think of the example of Nazi Germany. The problem was not the German people themselves, but the Nazi ideology that led to the wars, that led to the extermination of the Jews, that brought all manner of disaster upon so much of the world, and that the ultimate goal of the Allied forces was to denazify Germany, not to get rid of all the Germans, but to get rid of this pernicious, corrosive, destructive worldview. And in the same way, we see this going on in Deuteronomy chapter 7. The problem was not the Canaanites themselves. We see a lot of Canaanites being assimilated into the land of Israel. That they become part of the people. Uriah the Hittite and so forth. I mean, these are people who are assimilated in, and they're willing to live under the laws of the Israelites. And so, but where the Canaanites posed a threat when they're engaging in things like, bestiality, infant sacrifice, ritual prostitution, do we say, yeah, we need to respect that kind of a culture. We need to honor that culture, that lifestyle, and so forth. There are some things that are deeply wrong, and of course, the Lord waits over half a millennium before judgment comes on the Canaanites. But there is a wickedness to Canaanite practices. And so the issue is not the ethnicity. The issue is certain practices. And if these religious practices lead to the killing of children, if they lead to ritual prostitution and in other manners, other forms of oppression, these are things that are indeed pernicious, that actually, and we could also make this clear too, that God's plan for redeeming the world, including the Canaanites, that God, the Canaanites are mentioned in the Psalms and the prophets as being those who are going to be included in the final people of God, the coming into the people of God from various nations, that this is something that God has as the ideal, but there's a short-term obstacle, namely the corruption that the Canaanite culture is bringing, and could actually undermine God's plan for the world if the Israelites are so compromised by Canaanite practices, unless they get rid of these idols and altars and so forth that Deuteronomy 7 is talking about. There is this picture of a concern of getting rid of those things that will mislead the Israelites, the practices, the religious practices that of the Canaanites that the Israelites need to get rid of. And once you do this, you've actually you've created a kind of decanonization, that like denazification. You've gotten rid of the pernicious elements that are associated with Canaanite religion, and if you have Canaanites there who are willing to live in the midst of Israel, and you do have a lot of the Canaanites still hanging out there, even at the time of David and Solomon and so forth, that they're living alongside the Israelites. But so long as they're not posing any sort of a threat to Israel's identity and mission, then there doesn't seem to be any sort of a problem. The problem is when you keep the idols, when you engage in the practices that the Canaanites are engaging in, that's where the problem comes.
Right. At this point, I want to seg into talking about the work of Greg Boyd and Randall Rouser. I actually meant to bring this up later, but since their names came up, I've read a little bit about what both of them have to say. It seems like Greg Boyd and Randall Rouser both operate off of this idea that God didn't actually command any of these things. It's more like, how do I say it? It's like God allowed the Israelites to falsely attribute things to him, and God bore it with until Jesus came, and then Jesus set the record straight, saying this was never actually God's will. You just thought it was. Maybe you can unpack a little bit, where that idea comes from, and how you would critique or respond to that.
Right. Yeah. I suppose the simplest way to get right into it is to make this differentiation that people like Greg Boyd and Randall Rouser kind of follows this, and but originally attributed to Eric Seibert, an Old Testament scholar at Messiah College, who said that there is a distinction between the actual God and the textual God here. The actual God is the God who is a pacifist, who doesn't do anything like command capital punishment, does not engage in taking the lives of human beings through violence, or like striking. Even in the New Testament, Ananias and Sapphira. That Greg Boyd says that God could not have done that. Maybe Peter abused his power as an apostle, but you can't attribute this to God. Whereas the God who says, Father, in Jesus says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. The God of love and compassion and mercy, that's the actual God. The textual God is the God of the imagination, kind of the fictitious deity in the mind of Moses or Joshua or other prophets who ascribe certain commands to God, to drive out the Canaanites, or to engage in some sort of a military battle or something like that against a nation that is a threat to them. God would never command that. God would never strike down in Leviticus 10, Nadab and Abihu for offering up this strange fire. That wasn't God that did that. But maybe demonic forces or whatever. So this is the view that they take, and I'd say that it is a kind of neo-Marcionism in some ways, in that it creates this kind of a dichotomy between the God who is perceived as severe in the Old Testament, who brings these sorts of severe judgments, and the God of love. And you can see hints of that, of course, in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament seen in Jesus Christ. But when we look at the New Testament, what do we see? We see Paul, and in my book is God of Indictability, I go into this in great detail. And Romans 11:22 is kind of a key text for me, where it says, "Behold then the kindness and severity of God." We see severity in the Old Testament. We see kindness in the Old Testament. We see severity in the New Testament. We see kindness in the New Testament. And Jesus is described as one who is, yes, one who says, come to me, or you're weary, I'll give you rest. That Jesus will not snuff out a smoldering wick or break a bruised reed. But Revelation 12 tells us that he will rule the nations with a rod of iron, and that there is the wrath of the Lamb in Revelation 6, and it's so terrifying that people call for the rocks to fall upon them. That's the severity of God. In fact, interestingly, in Jude 5, we read that in the best Greek manuscripts, it says Jesus, after he delivered the Israelites from Egypt, afterwards destroyed those who did not believe. So Jesus is engaged in these severe judgments in the Old Testament. So when we read the Old Testament with a Trinitarian understanding, we see Jesus is involved in these severe judgments of the Old Testament. That this is not just maybe some misunderstanding by some prophet, and some false command given, but Jesus is actually engaged in these kinds of judgments. Jesus, he does something pretty severe. My wife and I are just watching the Chosen yesterday, and we saw the driving out of the money changers in the temple. pretty severe activity, not your passive, pacifistic sort of Jesus here. And he says things like, those who anyone who leads one of these little ones astray will be, he said he should have a millstone hung around his neck and he'd be drowned in the depths of the sea. So again, very severe judgments here. And I think that when you read, what is problematic here is that these, theological experts are telling us that their view is an improvement on what the New Testament authorities themselves are saying. They're even, going out again, like Greg Boyd, dismissing what Paul says when he's writing to the Thessalonians that God is going to bring judgment upon those mobs that have gone against you. And I think it's just there's a lot of cherry picking going on. And I point out in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully, how Greg Boyd ignores text after text in the New Testament or other relevant texts in the Old Testament, where I'm looking, why does Greg look at these things? Like, what about Hebrews chapter 10, where it talks about capital punishment in the Old Testament, or where Peter says that the person who doesn't listen to this prophet who is to come, will be destroyed, will be utterly cut off. And so he's often ignoring a number of these very severe texts. And so I think that there is and he's of course dismissing the law of Moses and saying that Jesus repudiated it. No, not at all. That's just a misreading of what is going on in the New Testament. And so I push back and challenge those sorts of things. So I think that this, actual God versus textual God business is certainly not what the New Testament authorities are saying. We see in Acts chapter 7, Stephen's speech, Paul's speech in Acts 13, they're referring to God's bringing judgment upon the Canaanite peoples again, going back to the book of Joshua, that these are the sorts of things the Lord did. Hebrews chapter 11, where God helps people in warfare, that they're victorious in battle, that Rahab was not destroyed with those who were disobedient, and so forth. Those are the types of things that we see going affirmed in the New Testament. And and when you look at the kind of the broader scenario, you say, well, these New Testament authorities are taking those Old Testament texts seriously. Those things that you saw, read, heard about in Sunday school. those New Testament authorities are taking that hermeneutic of historicity and reliability, and again expressing the severity of God seriously. And I think some of these modern day interpreters are tamping that down for whatever reason. But anyway, those are a few things that I would say on that front. Right. And I just think it's an inconsistent and selective treatment of Old Testament texts.
Yeah, I think I did notice a similar thing to what you mentioned. A lot of these proponents of the textual versus actual God distinction, they apply to the Old Testament, but none of them seem to be willing to apply to the New Testament. Like when Greg Boyd treats the book of Revelation, he wants to take it for granted that Revelation is telling us what God actually thinks. But then if he's willing to go that lengths with the book of Revelation, why doesn't he do the same with the book of Judges or the book of Joshua?
Yeah. It is interesting. And I think, we could add, we see Jesus in red letters in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, talking about Jezebel, this false prophetess, and that Jesus says that he's going to, cast her on a bed of sickness to give her time to repent, and that he's also threatening to strike dead her followers. That's Jesus speaking there of temporal punishment. So there is a kind of selectivity going on here when it comes to, or the revelation or the parables of Jesus. I think a lot of that is just tamped down, and those parables are very severe. And even the commentary, not just within the parable, but when actually Jesus is offering his commentary outside of that, and talking about my heavenly Father will do the same thing to that person who doesn't forgive his neighbor from his heart. So there is that language of severe judgment, and so on. So there is that kind of commentary that Jesus is issuing, even in those severe sounding parables, that he's not just there's some that Jesus is just telling some falsehoods here, that there's something wrong with this parable but something right about it, and Greg Boyd kind of dances around some of those things. I think it's just a poor reading of those parables.
All right. So going back to the issue of Joshua and Judges, and maybe we can toss in First Samuel here because the Amalekite
Yeah.
conflict comes up there.
Right.
One of the main things that you bring up, and this appears in both your books as well as certain other books that other authors have written, is that Joshua and Judges seem to be engaging in some form of exaggerated warfare rhetoric. Like a lot of the passages, while they may seem harsh, they may actually be hyperbolic in nature, and that things didn't quite happen the way Joshua seems to be saying that they happened. So maybe you can unpack, like, how do we arrive at that conclusion? Are there any hints in the text itself that would lead us to think that this is what is going on?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's helpful just to note the ancient Near Eastern backdrop here, that you'll see various kings, pharaohs, and so forth, who are saying, whose annals of war will tell us, Ramesses the second or third, or Tutmosis the third, and so forth. They're telling us that the pharaoh basically utterly turned his opponents to ash, that he alone was left, that these nations are non-existent. And what we know of history, those are drastic exaggerations and very much poorly placed. That these nations that they had utterly destroyed end up becoming a threat to them just 100 years later, or Misha, king of Moab, saying that Israel is basically done for. Well, that was a premature judgment, because the Assyrians would take care of the nation of Israel in 722 BC. They were the one, they're the ones who really did the job. So Misha's pronouncement was a century and a half premature. So you see these types of things, and you recognize, yes, there is a warfare rhetoric that's going on here, and it's helpful to consider how you have an idealized description, which is common in these ancient Near Eastern war texts, but Israel also injects a realistic understanding too. The surrounding nations, they were just totally idealistic about this, and they didn't talk about some of the dark corners, the things that they didn't accomplish. They just make it sound like it's full of pure victory, nobody left alive, and so on. Well, the Israelites' accounts do mention lots of survivors, that Joshua said that there's still nations that need to be driven out, that the task was not done, even though we do read that the land had rest from war, etc. Well, when you look at what actually was taken over by that time, it was only like a third of the land that God has promised to Israel. So there are 2/3 still left, but yet it was the land had rest from war. It was peace that Joshua brought, and so on. And you also when you look at these sorts of texts, like compare Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 9, where you have kind of a comparison within short order of what God tells the Israelites he's going to do. On the one hand, he tells them that he's going to drive out the Canaanites quickly. That's the idealized version. But God also says he's going to drive them out slowly, because otherwise they would be overcome by wild animals and so forth. So which is it? Is it quickly, or is it slowly? Again, within just a couple of chapters of each other. That's the kind of thing that we see going on. So Joshua will be giving us typically the more idealized version, leaving no survivor, etc. And then you see the more realistic picture in Judges chapter 1, where they could not drive them out, they could not drive them out, they could not drive them out, repeated in that chapter. So you're reminded that this was kind of a long haul sort of a thing. It did not take, it did not happen immediately. It was a gradual sort of a taking of the land of Canaan. So those are some things that I would want to bring into the picture. And I already have hinted at some of these things with regard to, that language, comparing the two kings and what Deuteronomy 2 and 3 we're talking about. But going to the text of 1 Samuel 15, where we look at the Amalekites, notice first of all in chapter 14:48, the Amalekites are engaged in a raid against the Israelites. So they're already, I mean, the Amalekites are pretty nasty. From the very beginning, the Amalekites have been trying to get after the Israelites. They attacked them when they've just crossed the Red Sea. They're exhausted and so forth, but they are victorious. The Israelites are victorious over the Amalekites. But so you have this you have this raid of the Amalekites against the Israelites. So Samuel tells Saul to wipe everybody out, man, woman, young and old. So let's take this a bit at a time here. So I think this is hyperbole, this is exaggeration, just as Moses said, leave alive nothing that breathes and so forth. We see that Joshua, he did all that Moses commanded, but lots of people are left alive. So there is that exaggeration that is just kind of baked into the ancient Near Eastern war texts, like Joshua. And but with regard to the Amalekites, we're told in chapter 15, verse 5, that there is going to be a battle at this city of Amalek, probably some sort of a semi-citadel. There's going to a battle take place. So this is really the focal point, that there's this battle that takes place, and the Kenites, who are friendly with the Israelites, are there at this city. And Saul sends word to them saying, "We don't have an issue with you. You've been our friends. You've been, and indeed, Jethro, Ruel, Moses' father-in-law, is described as both a Kenite as well as a Midianite. But so basically, go. We don't want to fight against you. So the Kenites leave. So there's going to be a pitched battle with the Amalekites. Do you think there will be women and children hanging out here? Well, of course not. They're going to be leaving if they know a battle is going to be taking place. It's just kind of standard protocol. So when Saul fights against the Amalekites at the city of Amalek, we're told, not just by Saul, and Greg Boyd misrepresents this, saying that Saul was fibbing about this, saying that he had done all the Lord commanded when he really didn't. No, the narrator himself also in that text says that Saul, however we're to translate the word utterly destroyed, haram, he utterly destroyed the Amalekites. So he fulfilled that command, but it was only at that citadel city where he did that. So that's why he took the animals from there and so forth, kept the best of them, and didn't get rid of them. So Saul had done, up to a point at least, he'd been victorious and had taken care of the Amalekites. So that part is true. Of course, there's King Agag, whom he didn't kill, and that should have, of course, been the first order of business. But interestingly, Saul fights the battle. He has this, and this is standard ancient Near Eastern hyperbole, is one layer of it, where you have mention of a pitched battle at a particular site, and then you have this picture of universal conquest. So Saul fights them from basically Arabia to Egypt. That's, the large swath of land. That's part of the exaggeration that's there. And when we get to chapters 27 and 30 of 1 Samuel, David is fighting against the Amalekites. Well, I thought that Saul utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Well, we read later on that David is fighting against an army of the Amalekites, and 400 of them flee on camels and so forth. And David fights against these Amalekites and chases them in that same basic direction, to Egypt. Again, part of that exaggerated aspect of ancient Near Eastern war texts. So we have so that's why these sorts of scenarios have led people to conclude that the term haram, utterly destroy, means something more like decisive victory or have a victory over, or it could mean, sometimes it simply means exile. We see this hints of this in Deuteronomy. We see it in the word haram is used in Jeremiah 25, 9 through 11, where God says he's going to, quote, utterly destroy Judah and leave their cities in everlasting desolation. But that city, those cities are only left in everlasting desolation for 70 years. And Judah, those who are not remaining in the land, many of them come back from Babylon. So again, it is that sort of it has the sense more of exile rather than anything else. And also we could mention that there are other, even at the end of Leviticus, chapter 27, we see the word haram is used, but it has that sense of consecration. It doesn't mean killing servants or priests or burning fields or anything. Those are actually consecrated to be given to the priesthood or the Levites in offer of service to the tabernacle. But again, it's not as though these things are obliterated, even though it's the word haram is used. It's also parallel to the sanctification, the kadosh, something is holy or set apart. So it has that kind of a sense to it. So the word haram doesn't mean, we shouldn't take it as for granted that it means just utterly destroy, obliterate, annihilate, and so forth. So those are a few things that I'd bring into this conversation.
All right. So with regards to the word cherem, I believe John Walton in his book, The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest, suggests that cherem actually has more of that connotation of removing something from use.
Mm-hmm.
And you can remove something from use in a variety of different ways. You can destroy it, or you can just forbid everyone from touching it. And if I recall correctly, in the JPS translation of the Old Testament, the word cherem is actually translated as to proscribe. Would that be closer to what you envision being the correct understanding of that passage or that word?
Yeah, I mean, there is something of a proscribing, sometimes rendered put under the ban or something like that. Mm-hmm. But when you look at how this verb is used, there is I think, a number of Old Testament scholars, growing number, in fact, whether it be John Goldingay or David Firth or others. I could include Lisa Ray Beale from Toronto. She mentions that something like victory, like in the book of Joshua, haram, just meaning victory, having a decisive victory, is an adequate translation for this. That even John and Harvey Walton, they talk about identity removal, and this is something that I hinted at with the Canaanites and also the Nazis, and they use the example of the Nazis, that the goal of the Allies was to denazify Germany, and basically what you have left after the Nuremberg trials and so forth, that whoever wasn't killed in the war or put to death as part of the hierarchy of the Nazi party, the German nation was largely intact. And in the same way, you could get rid of those pernicious elements that would be harmful to the Israelites, but still have the Canaanite peoples largely intact. And you have a lot of these Canaanites that are already being assimilated into the Israelite population. So it's not an ethnic thing. It's simply a matter of certain practices that can have a corrosive effect and would serve as a deterrent to the Israelites in accomplishing their mission or preserving their identity. So the Waltons talk about identity removal, even in Leviticus 27, where you have the mention of the priest or the field or the animal that are haram. Their identity is shifting from ordinary use to now service in the tabernacle or for the tabernacle's purposes. So it's an identity removal, from ordinary use, and so they see, even what we see going on with Saul. He doesn't engage in identity removal because he's preserving King Agag, who's left alive like a trophy, rather than putting him to death. And also Saul builds a monument for himself to create a name for himself. So he's beefing himself up in that same chapter. He's creating this memorial for himself. To create it, something to honor him, and creating a name for himself. So he's in a sense drawing the identity to himself. It's all about the identity of Saul rather than identity removal of, say, the king, who is like the trophy, the person who needs to be dealt with immediately, so as to in a sense undermine the identity of the Amalekite people by taking their king away. So those are some things that the Waltons will mention. I think that there's a lot of things that I've benefited from in reading the Waltons on this. And so in though some areas of disagreement, I think there's a lot of stuff that we agree with, or we can agree on.
All right, that's good to know. Before I continue the track of discussing the hyperbole language, somebody in the comments mentioned the Gibeonites, and they had an interesting question. Because it seems that in Joshua chapter 9, God is actually upset with the Israelites for not eliminating the Gibeonites. And even though the Gibeonites are spared and allowed to live among the Israelites as slaves or water carriers, or rather, it seems like that was a concession that was made, and if God had his way, he would have preferred it if the Gibeonites had been exterminated. At least that's the impression that the text seems to give. So what exactly is going on there? And does this create a problem with the idea that Canaanites could potentially be left alone if they're not posing a threat?
Right. Yeah. No. As I've mentioned before, we see plenty of Canaanites who are being assimilated into the people of Israel. We see, for example, of course, Rahab. She acknowledges the identity of the one true God, and she and her family are spared because of that acknowledgement. There's a willingness to align herself with the people of God. But before we get to the Gibeonites, there's chapter 8 of Joshua, where you have both strangers and Israelites in Shechem. It's not told that it's Shechem, but it's between Ebal and Gerizim, the city of Shechem, and that the people are listening to the law being read by Joshua. This is seen as a covenant renewal ceremony, and you have Canaanites right there joining with the Israelites. Why weren't they wiped out? Well, there is this willingness to come under the banner of the Israelite covenant and thus find refuge and safety. And so this is not unusual. We see later on in keep in mind Caleb himself is the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, which is one of those Canaanite peoples. And there's a treaty, kind of an agreement made with his brother, he receives Caleb's daughter as his wife when he conquers a city. You have other mention of other Canaanites that are kind of assimilated into the people of Israel. The Gibeonites are called out for their subterfuge, that they were faking this, and they should have consulted with the Lord. But given the precedent of chapters 2 and chapters 2 and 8, we see that God is willing to deal favorably with those who repent, those who are willing to join up with the Israelites. And of course, the Israelites do engage in protecting them. Saul eventually broke that covenant and killed the Gibeonites. And again, that was blood on his hands. And anyway, don't want to go into too much detail there. But we see added on other Canaanites who are becoming part of the people of God. If people were Canaanites and wanted to flee to the Israelites, that they could find refuge in any of Israel's cities. So you do see a kind of welcoming attitude. In fact, in chapter 11, we're told that no city attempted to make peace with the Israelites. It seems like there's kind of an openness, a willingness of the Lord to receive that, but there's generally speaking, there is a resistance to that, and the Canaanite, a lot of these Canaanite kings, these cities, are engaging in battle against the Israelites rather than trying to make peace with them. So anyway, those are some things I'd say, and I go into more detail on this in my book, "Is God a Vindictive Bully?" Keep on talking about that, but I've just added a lot more material that would encourage people to take a look at.
Yeah, I think that's a good plug for people to get those books. Now, with regards to the idea of hyperbole being present in the books of Joshua and Judges, as well as First Samuel. There's two issues that come to mind with regards to that. The first one is, if that's the case, then doesn't that make it difficult to take the Old Testament as historically reliable? Because if we know that the authors are doing this kind of thing, then how can we take anything that's written there as a straightforward narrative? Maybe they're doing this all over the place and we just aren't realizing it. It comes off maybe to a modern mind as being a little bit playing fast and loose with the facts. And then the second objection that comes to mind is, even if we grant that there is hyperbole, it seems like a stretch to say that there weren't any non-combatants killed in some of these battles. Like if we take Jericho, for example, I don't think all of the women and children were evacuated from Jericho because, well, we know Rahab and her family were there. And, they were non-combatants. So perhaps there were other non-combatants in Jericho as well. And they were eliminated along with the armed garrison. And maybe that was also the case in some of the other cities that are mentioned in Joshua and Judges.
Yeah, well, one of the, and somebody who's done a lot of work on this is Rick Hess, who has been, he's a professor at Denver Seminary and has written a commentary on Joshua, but also has done a lot of work on ancient Near Eastern sites, archaeology, and the book of Joshua, and says that you just don't have the kind of broad swath of civilians living in these cities. You have kind of a common pottery. It's kind of a low status pottery. It's kind of functional. There's no status pottery that you find in these places. Yes, you may have a prostitute like Rahab, a tavern keeper, who is occasionally in these places. But as you yourself mentioned, the majority of people are living out in the hill country, and so she could have beckoned them to come and stay with her when the battle against Jericho was taking place, so that they would be safe and wouldn't be in any danger. But largely speaking, these were not inhabited by civilians; they were administrative and military centers, and that's just what the archaeological evidence suggests. So that's I think illuminating to note. Now going back to the earlier question about, well, can we trust the book of Joshua if it's engaged in this kind of hyperbole and so forth? Well, one of the things that is helpful to note is that the book of Joshua and other texts as well, war texts in the Old Testament, will mention not only the idealized rendering of, that we left no survivor, there's, nothing that breathed, man, woman, young and old, and so forth. But then you read just a chapter or two later, or the end of the book, or Judges chapter 1, and you see that, actually there are lots of survivors, or that city is being taken again. And this is not, it's kind of like Sennacherib when he's, leveling a city. Then we're told he does it again. Well, if he's already leveled it, why is he doing this again? Well, this is just part of the ancient Near Eastern rhetoric, and Lawson Younger, writes about these things as he talks about the genre of the ancient Near Eastern war texts. And I think it's just a matter of doing homework. I mean, we read certain poetic texts, or we read the book of Revelation as being highly symbolic or figurative and so forth. Well, does that mean that the book of Revelation is unreliable, historically unreliable? Well, no, that's just how it is. It's just highly symbolic, and you kind of invert interpretive principles on their heads, from what you would ordinarily do with historical narrative, that you treat something as historically reliable, as depicting the events, unless there's reason to take something figuratively. Whereas in Revelation, you assume that you take something figuratively unless there are reasons for taking it in a straightforward manner. So you just need to look at the genre. What is the type of literature that we're talking about? And, in poetry and a lot of prophecy, you'll see a lot of metaphor, the trees of the field clapping their hands and so forth. Do we accuse the psalmist of not knowing how the natural world works? I mean, the trees don't have hands. What's going on here? Well, we understand that this is just poetic language, and we allow license for that. Why can't we do the same for ancient Near Eastern war texts? But as I said, these texts of Joshua and others will mention survivors alongside though, the idealized language of leaving no survivors. So unlike the ancient Near East, we have where if you're looking at the columns, we have a column of utter destruction, nobody alive, no survivors, and then you have that column that mentions lots of survivors over and over and over again.
Right. So I think it would be fair to say that maybe Old Testament history is like, it's more like a broad strokes history. Like it gives you the basic outline of something that did happen,
Right.
but it's not aiming for precision the way a more contemporary historical account might do things.
Exactly right. Yeah. So
Right.
we're seeing something that is historically grounded, but there are aspects of the genre that we need to say, oh, okay, I understand that now. That's just part of how the bravado worked back then, just like we do today in our sports trash talk, where we totally slaughtered that team, we totally annihilated those guys. We use that language, and no one is being accused of engaging in terrible crimes.
Right. Now, there's one more set of questions I want to bring up, and it has to do with the question of whether God could, at least in some instances, command the killing of innocent people. I believe the second half of the book, Did God Really Command Genocide, is primarily concerned with this one, where it makes the argument that God generally forbids the killing of innocent civilians, but can suspend that prohibition in at least a few special cases. Now, to a non-Christian, like a skeptic, that can sound problematic because it can sound like God is arbitrary. He could decide that if the circumstances favor it, he could decide that, I may have said that you shouldn't kill innocent people, but that rule doesn't apply right now because of such and such circumstance. And the other issue, and I think there is a chapter on this in the book, is that it runs into the first horn of Euthyphro's dilemma. So is that famous Greek dilemma where, is something moral because God commands it, or
Right.
does God command it because it is moral? And under this paradigm, it seems like it's running into the first horn of that dilemma.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there to unpack. Let me just first say something about the Euthyphro alleged dilemma. It's not a dilemma, but again, it's taken from one of Plato's dialogues. Socrates is speaking with this young man, Euthyphro, and won't go into the details of it, but the question comes up, is what is holy holy because the gods approve it, or do the gods approve it because it is holy? And if we apply this to, say, to a monotheistic setting rather than a polytheistic one, do we say that, in this case, does God command something because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? So on the one hand, if God commands something because it's good, it sounds like it's because there is some sort of a standard that's independent of God. Whereas there is the other alleged horn of the alleged dilemma is that God's commands are arbitrary, that goodness is fundamentally what God commands, and he could just as well command the opposite. Well, this is a terrible misunderstanding of the nature of God, the nature of commands, the nature of what is good. Because when we're talking about what God commands, we're simply talking about what is the duty of someone. If God commands something, then a person has a duty to do something. But we also need to understand that God is good, that goodness cannot be reduced to duty or command. God is good, and so he will issue commands. So if you think of a circle kind of symbolizing God's goodness or representing God's goodness, you can have certain facets within that realm of goodness or value, like beauty or even rationality, or deeds of that go beyond the call of duty, or kind of a super irrigation where maybe you donated your kidney to a stranger. That's a good thing, but you're not commanded to do that. So to call something a duty to kind of collapse everything that's good into a duty. And of course, duties would be included in that larger circle of goodness. God's character is good. But to say that goodness is kind of collapsed into mere duty misses the larger point. God himself is good and wise and just, and is not going to command something that is intrinsically evil. So you can't say, oh, God could just command the opposite. No, God is not going to command, you shall not love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. God is not going to command you shall engage in idolatry. God's just not going to do that. These are intrinsically wrong, evil, and so forth. And so they're in a departure, of course, from the reality of God, who is the one true God, and there should not be God substitutes. And and it's a departure from the very character of God. So again, that dilemma is basically say, well, we as it were, the so-called dilemma. Actually, the horns are broken by the third alternative, that God commands something by virtue of what comes from his own good and just character. So God is not going to command something that is intrinsically evil. And as mentioned a couple of times in the book of Jeremiah, talking about the practice of infant sacrifice, God says, I neither commanded it, nor did it even enter my mind. In other words, this abomination of child sacrifice is so far removed from the character of God that it's as though God never even thought about it. He couldn't have, he's like he didn't even foreknow this sort of an abomination could take place. And so God is clearly distancing himself from something that he simply could not command because it's a violation of his own moral character. So what then, could there be some sort of a command that God gives where perhaps an innocent civilian is killed? Is that possible? Well, it is possible, and we can say that if God does, were to command something like that, then God would have morally justifiable reasons for doing so. Maybe. And again, this is debated. Some people see in Joshua chapter 7, the story of Achan, who took that wedge of gold and that garment, that purple garment, and hid them in his tent, and then he was found out, and his whole family was killed. So what are we to make of that? Is that taking innocent human life here? Well, some people say, like Craig Keener says, well, the people who lived in that tent would have known exactly what was going on, that Achan was hiding this under the tent, and everyone would have been in on it. So everyone would have known what is going on. But let's just say, that Achan did this in his family's ignorance, they didn't know about it. Let's just say that took place. Well, could God have justified? Could there have been some sort of a justification for Achan's whole family to be killed in this instance? Well, it could be, like I mentioned with Ananias and Sapphira, not a usual sort of a thing, but an exception in which something very sobering is communicated to the people of Israel, that you are to engage in war in the way that God has commanded it. And there are serious consequences that come when you take matters into your own hands, when you get greedy, when you violate, because it impacts other people too. Notice that, lives were lost because the Israelites went to fight against Achan, and they, Ai, I should say, they went to fight against the people of Ai after Jericho, and they were roundly defeated. And so this cost the Israelites, and so obedience was something that was at a premium. And so to neglect this meant that the entire nation, in its attempt to take the promised land, was imperiled. That this inhibited them from taking any steps forward to taking the land because of that one individual sin. And of course, like I said, maybe the whole family was in on it. But even if not, the Lord could have used this to send a strong message to the people of Israel that you don't take these things lightly. Lives are at stake here.
I want to jump in and ask a few questions, if you don't mind. Give Lewis a break there and kind of wrap it up here, if you don't mind, Dr. Copan. So I want to go back to Numbers 31. I understand that you were saying that maybe this was something that Moses was coming up with, or this is exaggerated language.
Mhm.
I want to focus on the part that refers to the female children, the women children, as
Mhm.
different translations would put it.
Yeah.
And Moses saying, keep these women children to yourselves. What were they keeping them for?
Yeah, well, I mean, the presumption is that they could be kept for marriages, as we read in Deuteronomy 21, that there are certain protocols to follow, that you couldn't just, war rape was prohibited, that to engage in in some sort of a, we and again, I go into detail on this in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully, where I talk about that how in various ways war rape was not permitted, and I give various scenarios, related to this. Let me just cut to the chase and say that there is the permissibility of intermarriage after battle. So we see this, and again, there's a 30-day waiting period before there could be a taking of a young virgin to be wedded to someone. So it wasn't as though this was being permitted. Some people say, "Oh, it was to rape them." Well, when you look at what the legislation is in Deuteronomy 21, there is a very humane approach to this, where the person who is taken from her own home, she has a 30 days for grieving, kind of for saying goodbye, taking off her old clothing, putting on clothes of mourning and so forth, clipping her nails, cutting her hair. This is a time of kind of saying goodbye to an old way of life, and to coming into a new way of life. And this is actually has redemptive elements of, rather than in other nations, these would be taken as uh, prostitutes in the temples of the deities of the victorious armies. They would just simply be, put into prostitution, or they would have been outrightly killed. So you do have this, a number of redemptive elements that are involved here in how the Israelites handled prisoner of war or women coming into the nation of Israel. So it wasn't as though there could just be any sort of a sexual using of women on the battlefield, or thereafter. There's a marriage ceremony that took place before any sexual activity was permissible.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned there Deuteronomy 21, because that was going to be a question that I was going to ask in follow up with this. Because
Mhm.
yeah, it doesn't appear that you could just automatically lay hold of them and just do whatever. You have to have, like you said, that time period where you give
Right.
them to mourn. But I don't get any indication from the text that this is consensual or has to be consensual.
Well, I mean, there are elements of potential asymmetry here, where obviously this is I mean, there is if a person decides that he isn't going to go through with it, then he is not to humiliate her and so forth. So there is that kind of regard for that person's humanity. But this is, really, this is, the options are not very many in the ancient Near East. Prostitution, vulnerability to being abused by any predators that come in the aftermath, kind of like hyenas do, just to take advantage of the vulnerable, those who have been left behind, those who have no resources of themselves, at least to be incorporated into the land of Israel, means that there is some stability, that there is some ability to come into this setting where you have a new opportunity, where dishonor, shame have been removed, and that you could live as someone in the, as a fellow Israelite, and the laws were to, as Leviticus 24 talks about, that the laws for the alien and for the native were to be the same. So yes, there is some kind of asymmetry here, but in some ways, it's the best that you can do given the the horrible scenario of war and its aftermath. So again, we're not talking about some sort of idealized circumstance here and legislation that is just perfect. We're dealing with hardened human hearts, terrible conditions, and I think trying to find something redemptive in the midst of those sorts of horrifying scenarios.
I also want to ask about Exodus 21:7-11 that talks about the case of a man selling his daughter into servitude or
Oh, yeah,
slavery.
yeah.
Um, is it the case that he can sell his daughter against her will, it would appear, and that then the master can do whatever he wants with her at that point? Um, couldn't he use her not just for labor, but for maybe other things?
Well, I mean, it's possible, although those things were prohibited by Israelite law. Just because you're someone, of course, a person can sell himself into servitude, as we read at the end of at the end of Leviticus 25, where someone is so poor that he sells himself, even to potentially to a Gentile who is in Israel, who is a person of means. It's not ideal, but this is kind of a way of helping your own family when you don't have the means to support them to find a place where they can find food, clothing, shelter, and have the debt paid off as a result of working during this period of time. That this is something that is actually very helpful and humanizing. So this is again the mention of the taking advantage of someone who is a servant. This is something that is just a departure from the spirit of the law.
Is it prohibited in any actual laws, or you were just saying just the spirit of the law?
Well, it's the spirit of the law, and of course the picture of the of the female slave, slave, servant, and so forth. And I go into detail on this in my book. Is God a moral monster? In which I talk about that she is someone who is. Is she designated? Is this person who is being given to her to there's the possibility of marrying someone. Okay, again, we're not talking about taking advantage of someone sexually. There has to be a ceremony and so forth. So there is this possibility that someone is being maybe a man who's a widower, who can take on someone who is who has been perhaps a servant with a servant there, or can be married perhaps to his to the son of that that person. So we're not told all of the details here. But this person, if she comes in as a servant and can potentially marry, we do see this going on, for example, in an Egyptian servant in First Chronicles 2, where we have an Egyptian servant who ends up marrying into the family. So you have Yarha, who Yarha who marries Attai. Or actually, Yarha marries this Egyptian servant. They have a daughter, Attai, and so it's possible to have this kind of intermarriage within this kind of servant sort of a circle. So those sorts of things are possible. But I would just say just take a look at the what I say in the in covering this in my book, Is God a Moral Monster? And again, this the question of if there is a So anyway, I try to go into this, and if you want to look into even more detail on this, there's a terrific book called The Flame of Yahweh by Richard Davidson, Old Testament scholar, who goes into all of, it's a very thick book, goes into the topic of sexuality and so forth in, in the Old Testament, in every facet, dealing with polygamy, dealing with a servant girl, like in this passage, and so forth, and what the requirements are. So anyway, just a little bit of backdrop there.
But in this case, similarly to Numbers 31, it doesn't necessarily require consent on part of the girl, correct?
Well, I mean, there is the if a person is there, the assumption is if you're going to have sexual relations, you cannot, it has to be within a marriage context. So, for example, if there's a servant, we read elsewhere, someone who is a servant girl and someone who, and she is engaged to be married, and someone violates her, then there is a penalty there's a penalty against that. So it's not just you can do whatever you would like to someone just because that person's a servant. So, and again, we see servants who are married, not simply, taken advantage of.
Yeah, but you can marry them without their consent, and therefore,
I mean, there is usually when a father is involved, there is a quote, bride, a gift that goes along with that. And so this is again, you could kind of see this where there is someone who has perhaps seduced a young girl. We see this in Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 22, where we have mentions of seduction. Again, it's not rape. That's a misrepresentation, but there's the possibility of a seducer with a girl who is underage to pay a certain amount, but the girl has to concede, or has to agree to marry him. And again, this is in consultation with her father. So it's not as though everything is taken out of the father's hands. There are these sorts of transactions, and we look at, as we compare laws, we can see that there are some options, but also certain freedoms that come. That this is not a done deal. So these things would be done in arrangement with the father, who is kind of the point person of the home, and simply isn't going to let his daughter go to anyone to do whatever he wants with her.
Yeah, and I know we're pressed for time here, coming up the clock at 2 hours. So let me maybe just wrap it up with one more follow-up question. So from what I can tell, the women, children, and Numbers 31, just kind of looking at the term here, it looks like these are girls who are young enough that they don't know the difference between right and wrong, and they can't walk long distances. At least that's how the term seems to be used. So this seems to be really, really, really young. Now, yes, the Israelites are marrying them, right? They're not engaging in these acts outside of marriage, but
Right.
They're, from what it appears,
Yeah.
In an asymmetrical way, as you noted there, marrying the girls without their consent.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
they're incredibly young.
Yeah, and I should say too that it is not that all girls are of marriageable age either, so they would just be assimilated into the land of Israel. So, but those who are of marriageable age, then that would be a different scenario. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious because the girls that are being described as they can keep for themselves, they appear to be really, really young. Am I misreading that?
I mean, we're not told, but this is in terms of there is this presumption that they can be taken. Again, the standard understanding would be that they would be could be assimilated in. We see kind of hints of this in even the chapter, kind of hinted at perhaps in Deuteronomy chapter 20. Where the women and children are spared. But what do you do with those who are prisoners of war? They could be assimilated into the people of Israel. And that's how, that's what typically happened in the aftermath of war, unless, say, women or girls were put into prostitution in temples. They could be assimilated into the land, the people of Israel. And again, the whole marriage thing would just, if marriage is not appropriate, then it wouldn't apply. But the assimilation of those who would otherwise be left vulnerable, that these could be taken in. and placed within Israelite homes. But that's kind of a standard operational procedure in Israel. So anyway, that's where I would land on that.
Well, I have a lot of other questions, but I know we're out of time. I want to give you an opportunity to put in a plug for your work. We've been talking about some of your books. Maybe tell the audience, are you working on any new books? And is there a website that they can go to find out more about your material?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, a few things. One is, well, of course, come study with us at Palm Beach Atlantic University in our MA Philosophy of Religion program. We've also got an an undergrad program in apologetics. And so we certainly would encourage you to come. We've got a hybrid program, but also it's better if it's on the ground and you're a residential student for our MA Philosophy of Religion program. And it's a wonderful community. But yeah, if you're interested in looking at various books, you can check out my website. Also, Amazon is a place where you can look at things that I've already published. I do have several books that I'm working on. One is a book on leadership coming out next month. Or at least, it'll be somewhat available through Amazon and so forth. But it's on a book on leadership that I co-authored with two other persons, and it emphasizes the importance of character as the kind of the grounding for leadership. And then two views on hell that I'm co-editing with Chris Date, and it's a book that looks from different disciplines at two sides of the issue: hell as eternal conscious punishment, or hell as annihilation, the conditional immortality view. So that's coming out in December. I'm doing I've done a reworking of the co-authored book that I did with Robertson McQuilkin on biblical ethics. So the fourth edition is coming out again around December or January, and then a book called From Myths to Meaning on Genesis 1 through 11 that I'm co-authoring with Doug Jacoby, coming out with InterVarsity next year, and looking at some of the scientific genre sorts of issues related to the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Did a third edition of True for You But Not for Me, and that should be out sometime in the spring of 2027. And just have done various articles and chapter contributions and so forth, also forthcoming. So I'll keep posting those things at my website as they become available.
When's the one on hell coming out?
Should be December.
That'd be fun to have you back on to talk about that. I actually spoke to Chris Date. I had a debate with him years ago on the topic, so I'd actually love to hear both you and his thoughts on it. Maybe you can get both of y'all on.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, that'd be fine. I mean, we've had conversations with Sean McDowell and Preston Sprinkle and of course Kirk Cameron, all in the last couple of months. So
right, because of the recent
good set of conversations.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I don't want to keep taking up too much of your time here. We're at 2 hours. Appreciate you. And again, you're always welcome to come back on. Love.
You're very kind. Thank you. Great to be with you guys. Thanks for the good questions, and appreciate your, the good work you're doing. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
God bless.